I begin by defining two themes that I'll be using a lot today. The first is social capital, defined by political scientist Robert Putnam as social networks and their corresponding values and norms of reciprocity. Simply put, social capital is about the idea, just as other forms of capital have value, that social connections have value to people and communities that possess them. Another term I'll be using a lot today is urbanization. Simply put, urbanization is just the idea of people moving from rural to urban settings. The pace of movement to cities today over the last 50 years has been staggering. In fact, over 165,000 people a day move from rural to urban areas. While urbanization has done a lot of good things for us, I ask the question, what have we sacrificed for this urbanization success? I argue that one of the biggest costs of urbanization is a decline in social capital. Robert Putnam, in his very famous book, Bowling Alone, studied social capital declines in America over 4 decades. He found declines in dozens and dozens of variables related to social capital, including declines in voluntary associations, card playing, family dinners, people having dinners with their friends, spontaneous interactions, and most troubling, he found declines in generalized trust, which is our overall trust in one another. Putnam partially blamed the declines in social capital on suburbanization. Troubled by these findings, Putnam argued that social capital and the trust it engenders is an essential aspect of our communities, and went so far as to say that social capital is the glue that holds the fabric of society together. There are a number of studies that also point to the importance of social capital. One such study was conducted by Bronnie Ware, a hospice nurse who asked her patients when they were at the end of their lives what had been their biggest regrets in their life. She compiled a list of the most 5 common regrets that people had when they were dying. Amazingly, 2 of the top 5 regrets were directly related to social capital. The number 4 most common regret was wishing that they had stayed in touch with their friends and not let golden relationships slip away. The number 2 most common regret was that they hadn't worked so hard, that they wished they hadn't worked so hard and they had spent more time with their children and families. This was true of all men in the study. There wasn't a single man that didn't have this regret. For those of you who are curious, the number 1 regret, even though it's not related to social capital, was a feeling that they wish they had had the courage to live a life true to themselves and not one expected of them by others. Another study that looked at social capital and its importance in society was the Grant study. This study is very recent. It looked at 268 Harvard University males over a 75-year period. Using this data, Dr. Valiant wanted to find out what the formula for a happy life was. So he poured through 75 years of data and dozens of variables and found that only one variable consistently pointed to a happy life for subjects in the study. That variable was having warm relationships with others. Later, he condensed this into the simple idea that happiness is love, period. Other studies also point to the benefits of social capital over the lifetime. These studies suggest that social capital is beneficial for people, those who have more social capital have better child health, have more academic success, are more likely to find a job, and are more likely to be successful once they do find a job. Overall, these studies by Ware, Valiant, and others point to the immense importance of social capital in our lives. Recently, in reading The Clan of the Cave Bear with my daughter, it dawned on me that hunter-gatherers never lacked spontaneous interactions. They never regretted not keeping in touch with their friends, and they never regretted working too hard and neglecting their children and families. They had very different lives than ours. On average, hunter-gatherers worked 2 to 5 hours a day and spent the rest of their time on pursuits such as carving, painting, dancing, and socializing. It sounds pretty good, right? Contrast this with modern humans. We work 8+ hours a day and spend the rest of our free time watching TV, or spend most of our free time watching TV or going online. We also sometimes do what Sherry Turkle calls being alone together, which is going online and using applications such as Facebook, Twitter, or Tumblr. I love this idea of being alone together because it really makes sense that even though we're together, we're still alone in our houses on these social medias. So it's interesting, studies show that online connections do not engender the same level of trust, and they also do not provide feelings of support for people that have them. So they're very different than face-to-face interactions. More and more, there's a feeling that society is lacking something when it comes to the quality of our social lives. So what is the solution to declining social capital? I argue that it is not urbanization itself that is to blame for declining social capital, but poorly designed urbanization, which this is. So let me just do a quick story highlighting how it is that I became interested in social capital and its relationship to the built environment. When I graduated college, I had the opportunity to live in Madrid, Spain, which was amazing. I learned 3 very important lessons during this time. The first lesson I learned was that the game of football, or what we call soccer here, is much more interesting than I had been led to believe when I was growing up in the United States. If you don't know football in Spain, you can't talk to anybody. The second thing I learned, that trying to date while you're living with your Spanish grandmother is really not a good idea. And the third thing I learned is the true meaning of the word social capital. I lived in a community outside of Madrid called Puerto Hierro. This community, I very quickly began to realize, was different than anything else I had ever been in. All of the neighbors seemed to know each other's names. There were probably 1,200 people in this community. They all knew one another pretty personally. They often interacted spontaneously. And most importantly, they supported one another in things like carrying groceries for an elderly grandmother, or helping somebody watch their child if they had to go to the grocery store, or giving advice on dating or work or hobbies, anything like that. In this community, I felt supported like I never had before. When I started graduate school, I stumbled across a solution to this problem of declining social capital, the new urbanism. And at the time, I didn't even know it was a problem. So the new urbanism proposes that the built environment can be used to create social interaction and social capital. So just some examples here. A front porch. This is mixed-use zoning here. This is a picture of what I call mixed-use zoning, mixed housing. And then this is a picture of backloaded garages. You probably don't know what that means, but it means having the garage in the back of the house rather than the front, which sounds stupid, but I'll explain to you later why that's actually a good idea. So I'm just going to kind of explain a little bit about some of these pictures. The idea behind mixed-use zoning is that when you have like modern-day developers, you put the commercial over here and the residential over here, and you put the industry over here. And the idea with new urbanism is let's bring some of this stuff back into our neighborhoods, especially the amenities that we use a lot. So why don't we bring back a local market? Let's bring back maybe a yoga studio, a cafe, things that people might want to use on a daily basis. The thing that happens when you bring this back into the neighborhood is that people walk more in their neighborhoods, and it creates a place where people can interact in their community. Mixed housing is a little bit of a different idea, but it's saying instead of creating these suburbs with cookie-cutter houses where everybody's house looks exactly the same, if you're at a party at your neighbor's house, you don't need to ask where the bathroom is because you know where it is, right? So instead of cookie-cutter housing, let's create housing that looks different, that has bigger houses, smaller houses, granny flats, things like this, maybe some rental housing. The idea is that it allows different types of residents that have different needs to move into an area. So maybe you get some older folks that have one kind of need, some families with another kind of need. It makes a more diverse community. And then this idea of backloaded garages, when I first heard about it, it sounded stupid. But then when I went to a community that had these, it was really incredible that you look down the sidewalk and there's not a single curb cut in the entire sidewalk because nobody has to pull into their garage. Anybody that has children knows that, when they're on their Razor or their little skateboard and they're zooming down the sidewalk, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I'm paranoid that someone's going to back out and run right into my daughters, and it's not going to be a good sign, right? So when you create these backloaded garages, what happens is that you have sidewalks with no brakes on them, and pedestrians can walk on the sidewalk without fearing for their life. It's much more relaxing. It's a much more pleasant experience. Overall, the idea of new urbanism is really that we should be building our communities based on pedestrians and pedestrians' needs rather than the needs of the automobile, which is what most communities are designed around. So that's really the major idea of new urbanism. So I'm just going to show you a couple of studies. I don't want to bore you guys with a bunch of details. I'm going to show you sort of a couple studies that I've done and how this stuff is used in practice. So one study, I looked at mixed-use zoning in a community that had mixed-use zoning in another community that didn't, and I found that mixed-use zoning actually brought people together in communities that normally don't come together and created all of these bridging connections that made the community much more interconnected and more cohesive than a similar community that didn't have the mixed-use zoning. Another study looking at mixed housing looked at if you have all of these different kinds of houses, the bigger, the smaller, do we get more diverse residents? And we find that definitely in terms of income, education, and especially age, you do find diversity. The one area you don't find diversity is race. All of these new urbanist communities are pretty white, but that's something that we're working on too. So you can see just really quickly that the mixed housing area, you've got real diversity of people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even some in the 70s. And if you look at the more traditional suburb down here, you see mostly people concentrated around the 30s, which is the sort of the family suburb where they're really trying to attract families. That's what a lot of suburbs try to do. Okay, and then lastly, I want to talk about something we're trying to do is see if whether the built environment can create social capital and whether or not it can create a shared community identity. So ways that you can do this with the built environment are using things like identifiable boundaries, signs, farmers markets, and public art. And the way this works is that with the identifiable boundaries and the banners, you let people know exactly where their community is. They know if they're in or out of the community. They can see if there's a fancy nickname for the community, something like that. Is it the South Side or the Iron Side or whatever it is? And then by having the farmers markets, public art, you could even include things like the piano or the air guitar, right, in the community. What those things do is it allows people to emotionally connect to spaces in their community and therefore kind of creating this shared sense of community identity. This is an ongoing study, so I'll let you know if it works when we're done. So I'm hoping that I've convinced you of three things today. The first thing that I'm hoping to convince you of is that social capital has declined in our communities. And second, that we should be really troubled by this decline, as social capital is one of the most essential things to a healthy community. Lastly, I hope to have convinced you that the built environment, if smartly designed, can be used to create social capital in our neighborhoods and communities. Thank you.